Hi everyone, my name is Perry Coleman and I run a small consulting company called Delta Environmental Consulting. For the last 40 years or so, I have messed around with salt fields, salt marshes and salt lake botany and ecology. Today I will be talking about salt marshes located between the land and the sea. While we're going to look at 4 very specific aspects of those wetlands, I'll first spend a little time illustrating what various salt marshes and saline wetlands look like. Coastal tidal wetlands are essentially the tidal flats, the mangroves, and salt marshes. Tidal flats and mangroves flood with the tides twice a day. Low salt marshes flood once a day, and the mid to high marsh floods much less frequently. A little further landward, the freshwater tidal swamps or back swamps occur, where creeks and rivers enter the salt marsh. Tides enter these areas occasionally, and the water is often brackish, and these swampy lands have a multitude of small flowering herbs. Sedgelands filled with grassy sedges are boggy underfoot in winter, but dry in summer, with subsurface waters that are often salty. Fresh water lies on the surface in winter. Extensive sedgelands host a variety of butterflies and insect life, some of which, like the predatory micro-wasps, are proving to be beneficial to our horticulture industry. On Sabkhas, which are a special type of claypan, the plants tolerate extreme conditions: hot, dry and salty. The hydrology of Sabkhas is fascinating, with evaporation of fresh water occurring from the surface, and this creates a pump that draws in seawater underneath the pans, resulting in incredibly salty conditions. The Commonwealth protected fan samphire, Tecticornia flabelliformis, is found on some Eyre Peninsula Sabkhas. There are some artificial saline habitats as well. Salinas, or salt works, are set up so that a salinity gradient from seawater through to hypersaline brine forms throughout the pond system. This results in different birds using different ponds, with fishing birds in the early ponds and shorebirds in the later ponds. Stormwater treatment wetlands that are located near the sea may vary from freshwater in winter through to brackish in summer. Some even have tidal gates and support salt marshes. The range of habitats in stormwater treatment wetlands is really remarkable and supports a very high diversity of bird life, as well as cleaning runoff from the land, which protects our marine environment. So today we are looking at 4 aspects of salt marshes in particular. We're looking at salt marshes as coastal defence, as carbon sequesters, as biodiversity hotspots, and as habitats that are in need of our help for restoration. Erosion of our coastlines is occurring right around Australia. Hard seawalls not only cost a lot to maintain, they have to be made higher and higher as sea levels increase, and they also cause even more loss of sediment and beaches in front of them. This is because much of the wave energy hitting the walls is deflected downwards, scouring away the beach in front. Land that is behind seawalls, if it was previously tidal, subsides once fresh carbonate-rich seawater no longer reaches it. These subsided lands are then even more vulnerable to flooding from failures in the seawalls. In England in the 1940s, several villages surrounded by seawalls suffered great loss of life when the walls failed in a huge storm. The Dutch, when faced with the need to keep raising their dikes, asked, "What if we could grow the land instead?" You can trust the Yanks to come up with a catchy marketing brand. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the US Army Corps of Engineers were faced by decaying coast protection infrastructure and decided to take up the challenge of raising more than just the dikes. The idea? facilitate habitats so that they could grow land as fast as sea level rose. They called the new approach living shorelines. At the same time, these eco-engineering processes were being tested out in Southeast Asia, where communities could not afford large rock and concrete armoured seawalls and were looking for ways to reduce the wave energy reaching their shore so that they could use smaller earthen protection works. So who are the natural engineers? Seagrasses reduce erosion along the coast and accrete material. They depend on mangroves, salt marshes and filter feeder reefs to clarify the water. Mangroves themselves accrete sediment, and as their root mass expands, the soil level increases around them. They need a good sediment supply from land and offshore protection from erosion by seagrass beds and reefs. Salt marshes capture sediment from land and are protected from erosion by mangroves. Reefs with native oysters can grow at rates quite a bit faster than sea level rise. They filter water very effectively, ensuring water over our seagrass beds is very clear, and they act as breakwaters so that the sediment accretes on the salt marshes and mangroves. Here in Australia, we have many miles of ageing, hard-engineered coastal defences. We are starting to see more of the living shorelines approaches being used to maximise the resilience of ageing coastal protection infrastructure, to give our hard engineering structures a chance to be more resilient and longer lasting in the face of changing inundation regimes. For those who are interested, I have a separate document that I can send you that looks at specific engineering approaches and the situations each approach may be used in. I could go on all day about this one topic alone, but for now we'll continue to look at some other aspects of salt marshes. So-called blue carbon is important on a global scale. The Isola event of millions of years ago that drew down atmospheric carbon stocks and cooled the planet sufficiently so that large mammals could evolve and deposited the material that forms the oil and gas reserves we harvest today was only possible because carbon that is sequestered into a salty environment does not decompose to release greenhouse gases. Salt impedes methagenesis, so carbon buried into salt marshes is permanently captured. When people look at the low-growing salt marshes, they often say, "But where's the carbon? There aren't any trees." Carbon is captured in salt marshes by a thin film of diatoms and blue-green algae that live on the mud surface. This living film is slimy and a bit sticky. The slime is made of long-chain polysaccharides that the organisms extrude to prevent themselves drying out. When the tides come in, the small sediment particles in the incoming waters get stuck in the slime. This buries the carbon. The diatoms and the blue-greens that made the slime migrate up to the surface through the sediment, make new slime, and are ready for the new day. And this is how salt marshes grow their elevation and how they bury so much carbon. But not all the carbon gets buried. A food source is a food source after all. The little mud crabs scurry about the salt marsh, eating all the slime they can. Then, at the higher tides of the month, when the salt marsh surface is inundated, these crabs release their zoe synchronously from the second night of flooding, in countless numbers. Studies in New South Wales with fish that entered the flooded salt marsh found that the stomach contents of fish entering the flooded marsh were 12% heavier than the same species caught in the creeks and channels before the flooding, or the same species caught after the high spring tides in areas where there wasn't any salt marsh to flood. While I have picked on the little mud crab here, the other little crabs that are found in salt marshes, sentinel crabs, etc., do the same. And this is only one of the trophic pathways in salt marshes. Fisheries scientists have only just started to look into this since about 2006, so there is lots to find out yet about the connectivity of our coastal habitats. While that previous example was a simple straight-line food chain, salt marshes have incredibly complex and rich trophic levels. The three main habitats that interplay are the benthic surface of the salt marsh, the aquatic areas of the creeks, channels and pans, and the aerial habitat, which includes the vegetation of the marsh surface. In the benthic habitat, the productivity engine of the salt marsh, the cyanobacteria produce an organic slime which is colonised by the diatoms and eaten by the little mud crabs and the other things that live on the mud. In the aquatic habitat, in the creeks and channels that hold water most of the time, protozoa, nematodes, copepods, annelid worms, rotifers and small crustaceans such as juvenile prawns who spend time in the creeks and channels before heading back out to sea, live. These creeks, channels and pools are much loved by wading birds such as the egrets, herons, spoonbills and the migratory birds like the sandpipers and stints. The aerial habitat, the grass and plant hoppers live in, the gall wasps, the beetles, spiders and snails, the egrets and chats, the magpie larks, the stilts and kites and harriers, the top end of town. This is where the hunters live. Rachel Carson said, "To stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist moving over a great salt marsh, to watch the flight of shorebirds that have swept up and down the surf line of continents for untold thousands of years, to see the running of the old eels and the young shad to sea, is to have a knowledge of things that are as nearly eternal as any life can be." Yet this is what happens to our salt marshes. Degradation. The bottom three are important, but they are relatively easily remediated. The top two are the big problems, however, and are the most difficult to remediate. They impact huge areas and have profound, and in the case of landfilling, sometimes irreversible consequences. As very few people are about to hand back extensively landfilled land to be returned to salt marsh, I'll ignore that particular issue here and concentrate on the restoration of existing and stranded salt marshes. The stranding of salt marshes behind roads and embankments allows the development of acid sulfate soils. The process results in land subsidence from a combination of compaction on drying and the eating up of all the carbonate deposits by the produced acid. As an aside, the breakdown of carbonates by acid sulfate soils creates significant greenhouse emissions as well. Reflooding acid sulfate sites is a relatively simple remediation. However, there are some challenges. Reflooded subsided sites have peaty organic rich sediment that is sodden and sulfate rich, so they have a lower pH than normal marshes. The good news is that the main low marsh plant species, Sarcocornia quinqueflora and Suader australis, both tolerate the conditions, and so the low marsh area of a reflooded subsided marsh looks very similar to that of an unsubsided marsh. By incorporating an upland buffer when remediating a stranded salt marsh, you accept that the land surface is lower than the natural marsh, and you have to allow for landward vegetation migration, understanding that there will be an evolving mosaic of salt marsh vegetation over time as associations migrate across the site. An alternative is controlled reflooding rather than a simple reopening of a stranded marsh. Controlled reflooding reduces mangrove incursion, slows the accumulation of peaty organic soils, and allows seawater carbonates to gradually address acid sulfate soils while reducing the displacement of any monosulfidic black oozes that may have developed in the stranded marsh. But there is a narrowing of the habitats. Subtidal and lower intertidal habitats migrate uphill, while the supratidal habitats can penetrate further downhill. There is an ongoing cost, of course, in running a controlled tidal reflooding in the maintenance of seawalls and control structures. This may, however, be the only choice where there is a very constrained site with no option for landward retreat. For existing salt marshes that are eroding, maybe your first question should be, have they been cut off from their sediment supply? Reconnecting creeks and stormwater flows into a salt marsh from the landward side can increase the amount of sediment availability. There are a number of ways to do this, but the simplest involve reopening bunds and embankments that have closed off creeks from the salt marshes they once fed. The photograph on the slide shows the wasted sediments of the upstream Mississippi. They cause seagrass deterioration where they land up out at sea, while at the same time the adjacent salt marshes are eroding due to sediment starvation. In some places, diversion of wastewater treatment discharge water, which is rich in phytoplankton, can assist the accumulation of sediment in salt marshes as well. The fresh nature of the discharge allows rapid growth of the root mass of salt marsh plants, which raises the land level. Hydraulic placement of dredged fill can play a part as well, but is only possible where salt marshes are being restored close to deep water areas that a dredge barge can navigate in. In highly developed areas like Sydney, restored marshes are so far away from the natural marshes that remain that all the seeds and tubers, etc., have to be brought into the site. Here in the Eyre Peninsula, there are usually natural salt marshes close by, and marine waters will bring in all the reproductive material that you need. People in other jurisdictions are struggling with the same problems we face in South Australia. Many subsided marshes in the US have surface elevations that are several metres below sea level, and restoration requires dredged fill and other expensive methods to get even the topography anywhere near where it needs to be before salt marsh can start to establish. Many of the issues in both temperate grass-based salt marshes and South Australia's Mediterranean chenopod-dominate salt marshes are similar. Subsidence, the production of acid sulfate soils, sea level rise, restricted sediment supply. At a recent Restore America's Estuary conference, there were papers presented on salt marsh restoration techniques from the Arctic Circle through to the tropics. The ideas were many and varied, expensive to economical. Management interventions varied from intensive to laissez-faire. There is, fortunately, a growing body of literature that can help give us ideas and cautions for our degraded salt marshes here. And it isn't rocket science. The photo on this slide is an accidental salt marsh restoration site. It was reflooded by breaches of seawalls in the 1930s that were never repaired. Such sites exist all over South Australia. If we take our keen observational powers to these sites, we can learn much about restoring our important salt marsh habitats. Thank you very much for listening today. We've covered quite a lot of ground in this presentation, so I wouldn't be surprised if you have questions or if you'd like more information on some of the aspects I've touched on. Contact me with any questions using the socials listed on this slide, and I'll do my best to answer.